Welcome to another episode of the Cassels Cast. My name's Eamon Cassels. Joining me today is going to be Ian Levy of FanSided to break down FanSided's NBA 99 rankings. Should be a ton of fun, so let's get into it. All right, joining me now is Ian Levy of FanSided to discuss FanSided's NBA 99. How are you doing today, Ian?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Before we get into the list, do you want to just give a quick introduction on NBA 99?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a revolutionary concept. A lot of sports media outlets, rank top 100 NBA players. We went with 99. Maybe we're slackers, didn't want to go all the way through to 100. Yeah, so there are sort of five people on our team collaborated on this list. I'm sorry, six, including myself. Chris Klein, and Leor Lampert are both NBA staff writers on our team. Chris is a real NBA draft expert, excellent with younger players. And then Quinn Everts is one of our other editors, who's an NBA expert. And then we had Wes Goldberg, who's a freelancer. He runs our Miami Heat site in the network. He's written for Ringer, a bunch of other outlets, been around for a while. He hosts Locked on Heat. And then Matt Moore, who's an old friend of mine, writes for the Action Network, hosts the Buckets podcast, and a bunch of other stuff. So that was kind of the group that put the list together. And to start with, I'm trying to remember, I think we started with a survey to kind of come up with a sort of a loose list. So I asked each individual person to rank their top 100 players, and then I kind of blended the list together. I just gave each player like a score, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, kind of averaged them out, put them in numeric order from there, and so that we kind of had a starting point. Made sure we didn't forget anybody as we were building the list. That's always like a fear. You get to 78 and you realize you forgot somebody who should have been up in the 40s or something like that. Just kind of made sure we had all the names, and then we just got on a call and spent an hour or two going over the list, moving people up, down. Everybody kind of has their own sort of like pet players that they maybe appreciate more than everybody else, so people would kind of make the case for somebody moving up a couple slots. Often the way those conversations would work is you'd kind of have a benchmark. You're like, all right, well, I think this guy should move up, but the ceiling for him is that guy at 54. I know I don't have him higher than that guy at 54, so see if we'd slot him in at 55. So yeah, we just kind of ran through the list that way. And I think this is the third iteration of the list. So when we go to update it, like we did at the end of the regular season, we're starting from last year's or from the previous list. So I think we did this year, we did before the season started, we did February, like right around All-Star break or right around the trade deadline, and then we did this end of the regular season update. So we're starting with the previous list, and usually we start with everybody kind of brings a few guys to the table that we feel like should really move up or down, 10, 15 spots, something like that. And it brings some people to the table that you think maybe should be on the list that weren't on the last installment of the list. So end up with a lot of tweaking in that 80 to 99 range. And yeah, and then we just kind of go through the same process, arguing the case for our guys and kind of moving them up and down. The other element I think that's really challenging too is we have them in tiers, tier one, tier two, tier three, tier four. So um, tier one is like your surefire MVP candidates, guy who can maybe lift a middling roster and maybe make them a contender. Tier two is the guys who are kind of just below that level. Tier three is guys who could still be maybe like a number two on a good team, and then you get down to tier four, and those are kind of like your high level role players, supporting cast, maybe third wheel kind of guys. And so we also often end up having some disagreements kind of on the boundaries of those tiers. Like I know this with this latest installment of the list, whether or not Jason Tatum belonged in tier one was something we talked a bit about, and ended up not putting him in tier one, top of tier two. So that's kind of another point where another inflection point where we're having some conversations.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great way to sort of come up with a list, just everyone talking it out and really sort of averaging out everyone's opinions. I really love how you guys do that. And then also just and like you mentioned with the tiers list, it's really a great addition because it sort of separates players. Even if guys are 5 spots ahead, there really isn't that much of a difference if they're in the same tier. So I think that's also a really cool touch. So yeah, sort of getting into the risers and fallers on this most recent installment. Who are some of the biggest risers?
Well, if we start from the bottom of the list, I know there was a few guys who were not on the February list that popped on and also popped on like real high. So like Josh Giddey was not on the February list and he jumped up to 79. He was so good the last 2 months of the season for the Bulls. Quentin Grimes was another one who was not on the list in February and jumped up to 76. I don't think there's anybody else who was new to the list who came in like above the knees. Most of the guys in the 90s were new to the list, but not huge risers. Peyton Pritchard, Stephen Castle, Alex Caruso were guys that we didn't have on the list in February and popped them on. In terms of some other guys who really jumped, I'm scrolling through the list. I know like Trey Murphy was a guy that we moved up a lot. I know he was injured at the end of the year, but he was somebody we were really excited about early in the year. Being able to see more of him down the stretch. Jalen Williams was another guy we moved up. Um, Jimmy Butler, that was kind of an easy one and kind of an obvious one. He was such a downer in Miami at the beginning of the season. Everything seemed to change when he came to the Heat, or I'm sorry, when he came to the Warriors. That was an easy one, moved him up 10, 15 spots. Zion was another one, getting healthy. A lot of those changes, I think, were things like a lot of those big changes in the middle and at the top of the list were things like that, where it was a guy who was hurt and got healthy, or a guy who had been healthy and got hurt, or someone who was traded, or sort of changed situations. We knocked Anthony Davis down. He was hurt with the Mavs, but he just looks different with the Mavs than he does with the Lakers. And so, he moved down a couple spots as well. I think the Suns guys moved down. Durant and Booker both dropped a couple spots. Um, yeah, Embiid. I know Embiid was sort of the hardest one. I don't know what to do with him. I'm trying to find him on the list. So he's at 32. I think we had him. I think we had him at like 16 in February, and 32 still like doesn't feel right. It feels like you're sort of splitting hairs, like when he's healthy and engaged, like he's a top 10 guy. And when he's not, he probably shouldn't be on the list at all, or he should be much lower than 32. And so putting him at 32 doesn't feel like you're really capturing, either side of him.
Yeah, no, 100%. There's definitely a lot of tough calls, and yeah, like you mentioned with the risers earlier, I feel like Quentin Grimes and Josh Giddey, just the way they finished the season, they had to sort of be on the list. But it's also very understandable in February the way they started the season that they wouldn't be on the list. So that definitely makes sense. And then as you talked about with Embiid, he's definitely got to be the hardest player in the league to rank right now. Just sort of as you said, when he's on the court, he's a dominant player. He's easily a top 10 guy, but he just really struggles to stay injured or stay healthy, and it's really struggled with injuries, especially this season, only playing 19 games. And long term wise, just with his age, injury history, and size, it's tough for me to see him really return into that level of dominance that we were so accustomed to seeing from him. So he's a really tough guy to rank. I know the Renner, who also does this list, I think they had him like in the 60s, which is a little bit wild to me. But yeah, I still think you do have to give him that level of respect, at least having him in that like top 35 range. So yeah, that definitely makes sense to me, but that's got to be a tough call.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, to go behind the curtain a little bit and talk about it from the perspective of sort of like editorial content decisions, it's hard to like you sort of have to have a unified approach to players like that who are going to who are injured and are going to be out for an extended period of time. Realistically, from February on, we knew Embiid wasn't going to play. If we were talking about the best NBA players in the league right now, like we could have left him off because we knew he wasn't going to, he was not going to be a factor over the second half of the season because he was not going to play in any games. But you want to keep him on the list because you want him there. You want to represent sort of the full array of players that are in the NBA, and but you also can't rank him just on his potential and what he could be if he was healthy. And so, yeah, it's really a challenge to know what to do with guys like that. We had the same problem with Ja Morant last year. Like, what do you do with him in the middle of the year in terms of ranking him when you know he's not going to play again and he's done for the season? You can't just leave him off the list because he's such a huge piece of the league. And even if he's not on the court, he's a factor in, he's part of the conversation. He's a factor in how the Grizzlies continue to build their team, about, how they approach, the way they use their young players, who they give minutes to, what their off-season approach is going to be. And so if somebody's still a big part of the conversation like that, you don't want to just omit them. Yeah, so in our case, mostly what we've done is the players who are injured like that, who we know are, probably not going to play before our next update, we might drop them, 10, 15, 20 spots from where they would normally be if they were healthy, and then we just kind of take it from there.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense to me. And I feel like a big thing with the list like this, as you mentioned, is sort of that consistency, whether it be injuries being consistent there, or just with certain play styles. If you really value two-way play, for example, or you really value just elite level offense, what are some specific skill sets and traits that your team is looking at and really valuing above others?
I think if you look at the list and knowing, the guys who worked on this together, I think for the most part we think about basketball similarly, and have some similar things that we value, some similar player types that we're drawn to. And I think you'll find a lot of respect for guys who are stars in their role. Like, we're not necessarily measuring all these players against the same template or the same set of expectations. And guys who can sort of do what's asked of them, can be, a lot of value in being malleable to the circumstances. A guy who could be, maybe a number one option on offense, but is comfortable sliding down to a number two because of who else is on their team or what their team needs at certain times. So I think we put a premium on that. And I think also, there, maybe not all of us, but some people in our group, I think there is a tilt towards younger guys. I think we get excited about potential, and so I think maybe some people might look at the list and might criticize the way we've handled some young players. Maybe there's some first, second, third year players who look overrated to some people. Like, I know having Amen Thompson up in the 30s. I think in February we had him at 37. He's still at 37. Maybe that was this most recent update. So I think to some people at the end of the regular season, having him at 37, above Chet Holmgren, above Tyler Hero, above LaMelo Ball, above Jaylen Brown, like that'll raise some questions for some people. But I think he's someone that we look at, we get excited about what he's doing, and we also are maybe making a slight bet that he's going to live up to our expectations, and he's going to be, over the 2 or 3 months between when we release an update and when we release the next update, we're expecting that he's going to play up to that level, even if maybe he's not the 37th best player on the day we release the list, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are two really good points. And I feel like just those guys who can be a star in their role, that's obviously going to skew a little bit more towards winning players, which I think is something that's important to value just because when you're contributing to winning basketball, I just think it makes a big difference compared to when you're putting up big numbers on sort of a crappy team. I feel like more players in the league can do that than sort of being these glue guys like a Derek White for the Celtics who just contributes so much in his role and really shines in that, or even like Chet Holmgren on the Thunder. He is excellent in his role. He's sort of considered a star, especially because he is a younger player. But at the same time, when you look at his numbers and the sacrifices he makes on offense, he's doing a lot in that regard. So I think that's really important to value, especially just with some of how dominant some of these teams have been, the Celtics, Cavs, and Thunder specifically. I feel like it's definitely worth valuing. And then with the younger players, I definitely agree with sort of giving them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, your example of Thompson was great, and personally, I don't have an issue with that ranking. I would say Jaylen Brown might be the only player you listed. We can get into that later that I would personally have a little bit higher and definitely above Thompson. But at the same time, when you make a offensive jump like Thompson did this season in the middle of the year, I mean, there's really no turning back from that in my eyes. You just start at a certain point, you just become that type of player. You're not going to go back to the guy who earlier in the season or in his rookie year was averaging like 9, 10 points a game. Once he got inserted into that starting lineup, he really made a star level jump, and I think you have to show him that respect because he's only going to get better as a second year player. So I think personally that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and he's making us look good right now. Yeah, this Warrior series, he's been fantastic. So making us look smart.
Yeah, absolutely. I really feel like I have a hard time deciding who's the best player on the Rockets team between him and Şengün. I would probably lean Şengün, and the list reflects that with Şengün at 34, but I think they're really neck and neck. I mean, when you look at just how impactful Thompson is as a defender, he's so versatile. He can stop really anyone, especially in the perimeter. And then he has the size and athleticism to guard bigger players, so disruptive off the ball. I mean, he's one of the best defenders in the league. And then you pair that sort of with the offensive jump that he made in the middle of the season. He, to me, has a really strong case as the best player on the Rockets team right now. And I do think they'd be a lot less likely to include him in any big trade packages. Obviously, we're seeing some Giannis and KD rumors. I'd be shocked if they included Thompson. I feel like they would be more likely to give up Şengün and then certainly Jalen Green. But that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, yeah, I would imagine Thompson's off the table, and yeah, I think you could also look at Şengün and say he's probably closer to his ceiling right now. It's hard to imagine him taking another big leap or another two big leaps. Like, I don't think he, as good as he is, I don't think he's getting to a Nikola Jokic level or anything like that. Where with Thompson, he kind of feels like anything's in play. Look at the not that they're necessarily similar players, but like look at the leap that Anthony Edwards took with his 3-point shooting in the past 2 years. I don't think anybody would have looked at him as a rookie and been like, this is a guy who's shooting 40 plus on threes, on more than 10 attempts, in a couple years. I don't know that Thompson's ever going to be that kind of guy, but those physical tools, it just feels like there's so much untapped potential with physical tools like that. When you're already making this much of an impact at this age, there's the potential to be sort of like a genre busting player, like to become sort of your own template, to not just be the next whoever, but to become somebody sort of totally different, and somebody that nobody else in the NBA plays like right now. Yeah, and I think he's a guy who kind of has that potential.
Yeah, 100%. I think just when you look at just how well-rounded he is, and then as a playmaker as well, he's really strong in that area. And like you said, if he ever gets that jump shot, I feel like he's gonna just be a legit top 10, top 15 guy in the league. So he's a really special player. And personally, I'm looking at his twin brother Asar to make a big leap next season as well. Obviously, the Pistons just got eliminated last night, but Asar's, in my opinion, almost just as impressively, at least defensively, as and he has a little bit of catching up to do on offense, but I think we'll see a similar jump. He did deal with blood clots earlier in his career, so I think that sort of set him back. And then also not having necessarily the same talent around him on the Pistons. Obviously, they did make the playoffs, but when you compare that to what Amen has with the Rockets, I do think it's a little bit different. So I would expect Asar to really take a jump next year. He'd be a guy that I'm looking at. Is there anyone that you're sort of looking at just based on the playoffs so far that you expect to really shoot up this list?
We haven't really gotten a chance to see the Thunder. I mean, they just dispatched the Grizzlies so quickly and so thoroughly that it kind of felt like a blip. And so I think, Shea and Chet and Jalen Williams, and even some of their I mean, I think everybody's familiar with Lou Dort now, but some of their fringe guys, Aaron Wiggins and Isaiah Joe and Kason Wallace, like I think some of those guys could have some big moments as the playoffs go along, and we could see some of them rocket up the list. I think Anthony Edwards too probably is another one that we maybe underrated a little bit. I think he's at 13. Yeah, he's at 13 behind Halliburton, behind Anthony Davis, behind Jalen Brunson. He probably belongs there, but he's a guy who I think, depending on how far the Wolves go, I think he could move up the list into the top 10 for sure, and maybe be knocking on the doors of tier one. Yeah, I'm kind of scrolling through the list. I think when we look at guys sort of taking a leap, I'm mostly thinking about younger guys, and I don't know that there's a lot of those guys standing out to me right now in the playoffs. Outside of Edwards and the Thunder.
Yeah,
Forgive me if I'm missing somebody. I'm checking.
that makes sense. I would throw Cade Cunningham in there, but we can get to that sort of in the next segment with debate and selections. But I do think he's a lot closer to that top 15 range than the mid 20s, personally. I think, especially you look at what he's done with this Pistons team without really having a true second option next to him, it's extremely impressive. And he really continued his elite play in the playoffs and kept the Pistons in that series when they were far less talented than the Knicks. And I think a huge part of that is just a testament to his greatness. And another thing that I really appreciate with his game is he has that two-way ability at the point guard spot, which we really don't see from many players. Sort of in addition to being one of the league's best shot creators and playmakers, I think his defense really impresses me. So I think he could get a bump up based on the playoffs. But I agree with the Thunder point as well, especially if we see them making a deep run. I do think a lot of those sort of glue guys will get a little bit more recognition and move up the list, especially if they do end up winning the championship. I think that's just huge. Like when you see these guys win a championship and you have that attached to your name, you're gonna end up making some big plays and some big contributions. So I think those role players will undoubtedly sort of get a bump up in the rankings. I think that's just natural with any team that wins it all. Even going back 2 years ago, the Nuggets, I feel like Aaron Gordon, after they won the championship, Michael Porter Jr., they all sort of rose up rankings. And then Jamal Murray certainly really shot up rankings, although he's more of a second option than a role player. But just I feel like the Nuggets is a really good example of that. And then you can go to the Celtics, although I do think most of their players were highly recognized before. But I think that's just another sort of recent example of that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Cade Cunningham is a good call. When we were talking before we started, we talked about the idea that there's five of us who make this list, and we all have some, personal players that we prefer over others. So, yeah, we can say there's some things on the list that maybe I don't 100% agree with, but are sort of a compromise among the five of us. But I'll call out Trae Young. I would definitely have Cade Cunningham above Trae Young. Trae Young's one of those players. Everybody has like the guys that just sort of get under their skin, and Trae Young is firmly under my skin. Heck of an offensive player, such an inefficient shooter, and he just sort of looks miserable to me, and his teammates look miserable often. And for whatever reason, I feel like I gravitate towards players who really look like they're having the time of their lives and make their teammates happy too. And Trey feels like the opposite of that to me. So yeah, he's one guy on the list that if I was making just Ian's version, he'd be quite a bit lower, and Cade would definitely be above him.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we can sort of shift gears into the debate section with sort of my opinions on the list and a few guys that I might have higher or lower. And yeah, I think we can start with Cade because I do think 23 is a little bit too low. I'm a huge Cade guy. I would probably have him 14 or 15, personally. I think Trey Young is a great example of a guy I would have over him. I think when you look at those two players, they offer similar skill sets offensively and similar impact. But Cade, at the same time, he's a much more efficient scorer, way better finisher. Trey's probably a little bit better of a playmaker, to be fair. And then you look at the defensive end, it's just completely different. I would say Cade's a borderline all defensive caliber player. I don't know if he probably wouldn't make an all defensive team this year just because of how competitive it is. But specifically at his position, I feel like there's few guards that make that level of an impact on that end compared to Trey Young, who is quite literally one of the worst defenders in the league. And I mean, I understand I'm sort of a Trey Young supporter in some ways because he's never really had elite talent around him. But at the same time, you gotta really put your team on your back sometimes and really show that you're one of those elite stars. And I feel like that's what Cade did. When you look at the Pistons team, they're just really not talented, and it's really all been Cade. They did upgrade their floor spacing in a massive way, but I feel like when I look at this jump, it's really been largely based off just how great of a player Cade is. And we really haven't seen that level of success from a Hawks team that I would argue has been a little bit more talented around Trey, especially this year. When you look at just some of the wins that they brought in with the Dyson Daniels and then drafting Zachary Rizichet, really surrounding Trey with that size. I do think it wasn't the most talented roster, but it was a great fit around Trey. So I feel like when I look at that and then seeing the season they had, I have to bump Trey down a little bit. I would still probably have him in that top 25 range, maybe like 25, 24, or just off the cusp, maybe like 26, 27, something like that. But I would certainly have Cade above him. I would say Garland is another guy. I just don't think he doesn't have the same responsibilities as Cade. That's the big difference there. And then sort of like Trey, he's one of the worst defenders in the league. So I got to give Cade the advantage there. Zion, when he's on the court, he's so talented, but I would have to just bump him down a little bit just based off availability. When they're at their best, I think there's a real argument between the two, but just based off Cade's availability and the impact he has, I would have to have Cade above him. Jaren Jackson Jr., I think he's a guy that might get bumped down after this playoffs, and I have a tough time arguing for him over Cade, just based off his sort of inconsistencies as a scorer. And then defensively, he is great, but he does get into a lot of foul trouble. Not the best rebounder. I think, sort of those things considered, I don't think he's a number one option like Cade. And that's another thing that I'm going to value with my rankings personally is just guys that can be a number one option on a team. And I think Cade, it's got to be above some of the guys just solely based off that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about, especially that Cade Trey Young comparison, how intentional the Hawks have to be in their roster construction to make a viable team around him. Like they just have so much more limitations in the kind of players that they can put on the floor because he is so ball dominant and because he is so terrible on defense. Whereas Cade Cunningham, you still have a ball dominant, primary creator, but he can work with so many different kinds of players. And obviously, like you want to have shooting around him, but you want to have shooting around everybody. But it doesn't look like that roster has to sort of like patch up his weaknesses in the way that you do with Trey Young. So I think yeah, that's a really good argument, a good observation, pointing out, look at that Hawks roster again this year, and I don't know how you, short of maybe like one more primary scorer or primary creator off the bench, I don't know how you sort of build a better roster around Young. I guess in terms of talent, Jalen Johnson's healthy. That's different. Dyson Daniels and some of their other young players a little bit more experienced. That would be different. But in terms of like player archetypes, I don't know how you create a better roster around him than what they had this year. And, it wasn't great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And I think if you just look at if you put Trey Young on the Pistons and you put Cade Cunningham on the Hawks, I think the Hawks are a top five seed in the East. And I think the Pistons aren't going to make the playoffs. So I think that's just such a big difference. And I'm always going to gravitate to a 6'6" guard who does a little bit of everything compared to a 6'1" guard who's so ball dominant. Even though you got to respect Trey really being so successful despite his size limitations. But I mean, it's just so much easier to build around a guy that's 6'6" and really has that jack of all trades skill set. So I think that just is a big advantage for Cade as well. He can, like you said, he can really fit with any lineup. So I think that's huge. And you look at this Pistons team, it's really interesting. They obviously only won 14 games last year, but the roster was constructed so poorly, especially from a floor spacing standpoint. And just giving Cade, I wouldn't even call it elite floor space, and just league average floor space and has really made the world of difference. And I think this Pistons team is only going to keep getting better, and I could definitely see them landing another star next to Cade.
Yeah, I mean Malik Beasley was huge. The rest of their additions were Tim Hardaway Jr. and Tobias Harris, and that made the huge difference. So that's definitely saying something.
Yeah, absolutely. The next guy I wanted to talk about, we sort of mentioned him earlier, was Anthony Edwards at 13. I would say even before the playoffs, personally, I would have had him in my top 10, closer to that 7 range. And then after just the first round, beating Luka Doncic and LeBron James and that Lakers team in the first round in just 5 games after most of the world, I know the big thing going around online was that all the ESPN reporters picked the Lakers to win the series. Doing that in 5 games and how dominant he was, I have a hard time leaving him off the top 10, and I'm sure he'll get a bump up as you mentioned after the playoffs when this list is updated. Ant offers so much, just an elite shot creator. As we discussed earlier, he's expanded his game to the 3 point range, and he's really became one of the best 3 point shooters in the league, which is something I didn't expect, but that just makes him one of the best all around offensive players in the league. And then you look at his two-way abilities, I think he's a great defender. He's very strong in that area. He can guard multiple positions. Obviously, just one of the best athletes in the league. So when you put that all together and the success this Timberwolves team has had over the last 2 seasons and how they've really overachieved in the playoffs, I think you got to give Ant his respect and move him up a little bit. I would definitely have him above Halliburton. I think Ant's just so much more consistent as a offensive creator. I think that's just a huge advantage there. Anthony Davis, especially with the injury history, I have a tough time putting him above Edwards. And then same thing with just how great of a creator Anthony Edwards is. I think it's hard to knock him there. I would probably him against Wemby. Yeah, that's a tough one because we've never seen a guy like Wemby before. But I do think Ant's just a little bit more proven right now, so I personally would have him above Wemby. Jalen Brunson is another guy I would have him over just based off of Brunson's limitations as a defender. And I'm personally not the biggest fan of how the Knicks have been sort of running their offense. I do think it's been a little bit too Brunson centric, and that almost hurts them in some areas. I think when you look at Ant last year, I feel like he worked a lot better with Towns than Brunson has in some ways. And I mean, you saw that in the first round a lot. They just weren't getting Towns the ball enough, and I think that really hurt them and made the series a little bit longer than it had to be against the Pistons. I think him against Mitchell's a tough call just based off how dominant the Cavs have been this season. So I feel like he's sort of right within that range. But I mean, it's really just tough for me to ignore how elite Ant's been in the playoffs these last two seasons.
Yeah, and Mitchell has a lot more help too, which at both ends of the floor, which makes a big difference. Yeah, like looking at the list right now in retrospect, it's for May 2nd. So it was like 2.5 weeks, I think, that we released this update, and it was probably almost a month that we sort of had the list like pretty much finalized because we had it ready sort of a week or two before it actually went live. Yeah, Wemby and Anthony Davis. I think we knew Davis was not going to be in the playoffs. Wemby was not going to play at all because the deep vein thrombosis. Yeah, in retrospect, maybe could have moved both guys down a little bit more. Yeah, Brunson and Edwards is interesting, but yeah, I think you make an interesting case. Like, it's funny because Cat's with the Knicks now, but if you do that switch players experiment, if you put Edwards on the Knicks with all of the 3-and-D wings and all that positional versatility around him, put Brunson on the Timberwolves. Yeah, I think you can make an argument the Knicks might be even better off, and Timberwolves might take a step back.
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm thinking. Another thing that really has impressed me with Ant, especially in the playoffs, is how he's developed as a playmaker. It's definitely been the one sort of weakness in his game, and I assume that was something that you guys kind of knocked him for, which is definitely understandable, especially in the regular season. It didn't look like his strong suit, but he really showed a lot to me as a playmaker in that series against the Lakers. And obviously, I wouldn't say he's a better playmaker than Luka, but in that series, he certainly was a better playmaker, and he's really getting better at reading the defenses and also just allowing his teammates to sort of shine. And I think that really helps just being able to count on your teammates and not be totally reliant on one player for scoring. I thought the two-man game with him and Randall has really developed nicely over the course of the year, and Randall has been huge in the playoffs. I think he's another guy that I could see sort of rising up this list if he continues his impressive play in the playoffs, which has always sort of been a concern with his career. But now next to Ant, we're seeing he's playing the best, really playoff basketball of his career. So I feel like in part that's a testament to Ant and just sort of how well he's developed as a playmaker. He, like I said, I feel like he's just reading the defense at just such a high level now, and I feel like that's another area of his game that's just really grown along with his 3-point shooting.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact conversation around Edwards, and I don't remember if we moved him specifically from February to April, or if his ranking moved because we were moving players around him, either moving players down below him or moving people up above him. But I will admit, I don't know how much this played into it, but I certainly had some Minnesota bias going into the playoffs. I thought I didn't think they'd get past the Lakers, and I think I was sort of expecting that. I was sort of expecting that they would be coming out of the playoffs kind of seen as a disappointment, kind of having to go into the offseason kind of thinking about solving some roster problems, and not necessarily it being Edwards' fault, but sort of, maybe rethinking some of the pieces around him and how they were going to make the best use of him. And I was, definitely wrong about that. And so, yeah, that might have been a missed opportunity to get him a little bit higher.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely understandable though. I mean, I feel like the first up until really the All-Star break, the Timberwolves were just such a disappointing team. They're really in that playing battle for a lot of the season. They were even outside of the playoffs. So I feel like it's understandable to sort of bump them down, and it didn't look like the whole Randall thing was working out, but to really close the season and then obviously in the playoffs so far, it's really looked awesome. And I feel like yeah, it's definitely like I said, I feel like it is understandable to sort of knock him for the start of the season and to be anticipating Lakers to win, which I as well predicted. I personally, the last episode we did, it was playoff predictions, and I had the Lakers going all the way to the finals. So I'm definitely gonna have to take the L on that one. But yeah, no, at the same time, I just think Ant's such a great player, and it's been awesome just to watch him develop his game. Like we discussed, I'm really impressed with the 3-point shooting. I never really thought he would get to this level as a shooter. But yeah, the next player I want to talk about is Paulo Banchero. I think he's just a little bit too low here at 36, and specifically with his teammate Franz Wagner, 29 above him, doesn't totally make the most sense to me personally. What was sort of the thought process and conversation specifically with those two, and then just Paulo's ranking in general?
Yeah, I know that it was a conscious decision to put Franz above Paolo. We talked about that a fair bit, and I'm pretty sure in February we had Franz above him as well. Um, my take on it, and I'm speaking for five people who probably have some different opinions here too, but I think this comes down to kind of the star in their role thing. I think Franz, to me, looks like somebody who is a fantastic number two, and Paolo seems like somebody who may be a little over his head as a number one on a good team. And so, yeah, probably in a vacuum, Paolo might be a better basketball player. If you were starting a team and you were drafting everybody, Paolo probably goes before Franz. But I think the Magic might have I think the Magic might have a harder time replacing Franz than they would replacing Paolo, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense to me, and I think another, even though I'm gonna eventually make the Paulo argument, another thing that sort of bodes well for Franz's case is just how well they played when Paulo went down with injury, and just how good he looked as as a first option, even though he's a guy that we mostly see as a second option. I will say what sort of separates the two for me. I'm a Celtics fan, so I watched the entire Celtics Magic series extremely closely. Paulo just has so many more offensive responsibilities than Franz.
Yeah.
And the burden he has there, particularly with the Magic's awful floor spacing, I think I really value that. And just how well he's played in the playoffs, back-to-back seasons, averaging close to 30 points in the playoffs, and really looking like that legit number one option, even though they haven't won either of their first round series. That's just something I'm going to personally value a little bit with Paulo. And I do think generally he is, to me, one of the most underrated players in the league. I personally have him top 20 for me. So I'm a lot higher on Paulo than most people, but I really just value that guy he's a 6'10" forward who can really do a little bit of everything. I think he's a very underrated playmaker as well. Even going back to the playing game against Atlanta, he was getting double teamed a lot, but he was really creating a lot of open shots for his teammates, just sort of with his gravity there and making the right reads. So that's another part of his game that impresses me. And then with Franz, his jumper does concern me personally. I do like what he brings to the table, sort of as another do-it-all forward, and I think the Magic have a great forward duo for the future there. But with Franz's jumper, it does just concern me. I mean, it doesn't. He's declined as a shooter these last couple of years, and it doesn't totally look fundamentally sound. There's a little bit of a hitch in it, and I think that really hurts the Magic, especially as they have no floor spacing. And Paolo himself, he's not the best shooter in the world, but he has looked better than Franz in that regard. And then I'm personally a little bit more impressed with Paulo's defense. I know Franz might have better on-off numbers and stuff like that, but at the same time, I think Paulo's just stronger in that area. He typically guards the opposing player's best forward, handles a little bit more responsibility, and I'm just a little bit more impressed with his two-way play there. So that's really where I'd make the case for Paulo. And I think if the Magic are ever able to upgrade their floor spacing, which really needs to be a priority this offseason,
Yeah.
as we saw, I think Paulo will just really take a massive leap and sort of be a consensus top 20 guy in the league if they can really upgrade the floor spacing around him because he's done so much with so little around him in my opinion. Obviously, you have Franz who's also really shined in that regard, but outside of those two, the Magic just don't have really any surrounding talent particularly after Jalen Suggs got injured because I don't want to disrespect Suggs. He's a great player in his own right, but yeah, they just really lack the floor spacing, and I'm just so impressed with the production that he's able to provide and the difficulty of his shot making ability with such limited floor spacing. So that's really why I'm such a big Paulo guy.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a case that going back to like the Amin Thompson Shingun comparison that Franz is probably closer to his ceiling right now than Paolo is. And if you get another primary scorer and creator in there, I think it makes a much bigger difference for Paolo than it does for Franz. Yeah, KCP was clearly not the answer. I don't think Anthony Black is going to be that guy as nice a piece as he is, and I don't think another kind of mid tier 3-and-D first round pick is somebody who's going to make a difference. So they really need to kind of figure something out there. I don't know where it comes from, but yeah, I think they're stuck a little bit where they are with their current roster.
Guy I would be looking at is Anthony Simons of the Portland Trailblazers. I think he could be available for trade. There hasn't been any reports sort of confirming that he's absolutely available, but I think for the right price, he'd definitely have to be available. I thought he was a guy they could have looked into at the deadline. When you look at Simons, he's an elite shooter, really well-rounded scorer, can handle the ball, very good playmaker as well. Obviously, the main downside with his game is just defense, but when you look at what the Magic have, one of the top three defenses in the league, they have the pieces to sort of cover up those deficiencies. And I think he could complement Jalen Suggs really nicely and then just open up the game as a floor spacer for Paulo and Franz while taking a lot of sort of ball handling responsibilities away from them, which is needed. I think when you look at sort of what the Celtics have built around Tatum and Brown, I would consider that a blueprint for the Magic. Obviously, you'd hope to get more of a defensive minded guard like a Holiday or White, but there's just so few guys like that in the league. So already having one of those guys who can space the floor at a decent level with Suggs is huge. So I wouldn't be opposed to getting a guy like Simons who might not be as elite of a defender, but can sort of offer a similar skill set offensively, just with how good of a shooter and playmaker he is.
Yeah, that's a great call. I don't think Cam Johnson solves everything either, but and it sounds like he's going to stay with the Nets anyway. But he'd be another interesting piece that I think could make a big difference for them.
Yeah, absolutely. He's just a great shooter, and he has that size, which the Magic have really built their identity around. So I think he'd be another really ideal fit. All right, so moving on to the next guy. I sort of mentioned him earlier, Jalen Brown at 46 to me. Obviously, a little bit biased as a Celtics fan. Especially after the finals run that he had last year, I would have a tough time coming up with an argument for him to really be outside of the top 25. I would personally have him probably around that 17, 18 range. I think when you look at Brown, he is limited in some areas, specifically as a playmaker, although he has taken a jump and he's averaging a career high in assists. But then you look at his shoot and dip. I know that's sort of one of the main reasons that he was penalized on this list, but just the impact he makes as a two-way star and a guy that could really be the number one option on most teams. And he really proved that in the finals. Guarding Luca, providing the Celtics with number one scoring production. When Tatum is either really just receiving difficult coverage from the defense and being double and triple teamed, blitz, whatever the case may be, Brown always steps up and he really provides that production. So I think that's huge. Or even in games when Tatum's injured, we saw him miss game two of the series against the Magic, and Brown stepped up with a huge 36-point game. As someone who always watches the Celtics, whenever Tatum is either struggling, injured, receiving difficult coverage from the defense, Brown has that ability to step up and provide that elite scoring production. And I do really think he could be the number one option on most teams. And then just when you look at his playoff experience and everything he's done throughout his career, it's tough for me to have him below guys that are just so much less experienced than him. Especially like a guy like Trey Murphy, great player. I don't know how he's above Brown personally. Jalen Johnson, similar things. I like what they offer, but I just haven't seen them contribute to winning basketball at the highest level, which Brown has really been doing since his second season in the league. I mean, his first season he was more of a spot rotation guy, but then it's really since his second season he's been a top 2 3 level scoring option on elite teams. So I that's why I have a hard time with such a low ranking.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, and it is one that has been pointed out to us before, and it is one that's been pointed out to us on other iterations of the list that he is often underranked by FanSided. I don't know that I have a great explanation for it. Looking at this list, I'm like, yeah, I'd probably put him above a bunch of these guys. Like if I was making the list personally, I'd have Kyrie way lower. I'd have him above Kyrie. I'd have him above Tyler Hero. I'd certainly have him above LaMelo Ball. Probably Trey Murphy too. I will say, like, from the list building process, weirdly, he is not a guy that people on our team have had strong opinions about. The case is not like, well, we don't like Jaylen Brown, so we're gonna put him at 4. But he is a guy that when we've gone through this exercise and built these lists, sort of like no one's excited about. Like almost everybody who's above him on this list, let's say between like even up to like Sabonis, like from like Siakam to at 26 to Jaylen Brown at 46. So in that 20 players, almost every guy that's above him, somebody in our group sort of like took a strong stand on that player and was like, we got to get so and so on the list right now. We got to get so and so on the list right now, or I think so and so should be ranked higher. And so often it ends up where we're kind of like, wow, we haven't got to Jaylen Brown yet. You know, like we spent all these time talking about these other players. We haven't gotten to Jaylen Brown yet. And we end up just kind of slotting him in somewhere. Probably underranked here. You make really strong arguments. Yeah, can totally own underranking him here. But I do think I do think that's a reflection somewhat of his career. Like he on the Celtics, Tatum gets so much more when you think about sort of the balance of those two players and what they actually give the Celtics on the floor. Tatum gets more than his share of coverage and maybe credit than he deserves, and Jaylen Brown probably gets a little bit less than he deserves. And even some of those role players, like this year, like you hear way more conversation about Peyton Pritchard this year than I think you heard about Jaylen Brown. You know, last year I think you heard way more about Drew Holiday and Derek White all season and even into the playoffs than you did about Jaylen Brown. So yeah, I know it's a little ironic to have us like in the media being like, well, the media doesn't talk about him, enough. But yeah, I think it is one of those things where he's overlooked in a lot of ways, in a lot of places, not just by us. And yeah, and you're right, he probably deserves a little more coverage and a little more respect.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's just sort of the hard part of putting together a list like this. Somebody's inevitably going to be underrated. Somebody's inevitably going to be a little bit disrespected, and that just sort of is the nature of these lists. None of them are perfect. I would be curious to see if this list had came out heading into the season or after the finals, just after such a strong playoffs last year, how much higher Brown would have been. Because admittedly, this season has been a little bit of a down year, especially from a shooting standpoint. He has dealt with several injuries, so I do feel like that could be sort of a factor, especially with the excitement element that you discussed, where nobody was super excited about him. Just sort of based off recent play, I could understand that logic. But yeah, like I sort of discussed earlier, I think you just have to give him the respect just based off how elite of a playoff performer he's been for his entire career and contributions to winning basketball. You gotta give him the nod there. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I feel like that it's just the nature of these lists. There's obviously going to be disagreements, and I mean, no list is perfect. And
Yeah.
I should have probably said this before I started the list, but when I look at the entire list, I don't see any notable snubs personally. The entire 99 list, I feel like all these guys do sort of belong as these top 99 players in the league. So I feel like that's one of the strongest areas of the list. And even though obviously there's going to be natural disagreement, I feel like that's one thing that I really respect about it. I feel like there's no players that I'm like, wow, this guy should have been on the list, or this guy really, I don't understand how he's in the top 99. So I think that's one of my favorite parts of the list.
Well, I appreciate that. And I will say there are some spots where I will admit that we've gamed things a little bit or where we have done rankings specifically because we think it might generate conversation. Josh Hart, Mikal Bridges, and OG Anunoby, they are still clustered very closely. OG is 52, Hart is 54, Bridges is 57. And I think in the February, I think we had those three in a row. I can't remember. But that was like a conscious thing where we were like, Hart has leaped Bridges, like he's of those three wings that sort of have similar roles with the Knicks. Like he's more important. We're going to consciously put him above them. There was another spot I think where we had sort of a cluster of point guards where we were like, this is interesting to kind of put these guys, in a little cluster as a comparison. Oh yeah, we ended up putting Franz in the middle, but 27 Harden, 28 Maxey, 30 De'Aaron Fox, 31 Damian Lillard. Like that was kind of intentional, sort of clustering those guys together as sort of a conversation point. Trying to think because I think there was at least a couple others. I know at one point we had Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan right next to each other. Some little things like that we think will kind of like catch people's attention. But yeah, I really appreciate it. We put a lot of time and effort into this, knowing that nothing is perfect and that every single person who reads this list will have something to quibble with and argue with, and everybody will find some player that they think we've slightly underrated or slightly overrated. And again, even we have people we feel like are slightly underrated or slightly overrated. If you have the other five guys on who made this list, they'll give you different answers. They'll talk about different players that they think from me who they think are overrated or underrated. Yeah, really appreciate you feeling like it's fair, even if there's some Jaylen Brown disrespect baked in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the point about Hart, OG, and Mikal was really good. And I personally do agree with that order, with OG being above Hart and then Hart being above Mikal. I do think this season, like you said, I think Hart has really surpassed Mikal. Mikal's been a little bit disappointing, and I think Hart just overall offers a little bit more with just how elite of a rebounder he is. His connective playmaking has really been huge for that team, and I do think he's just a little bit more valuable than Bridges at this point. Friends that are Knicks fans, and a lot of them will say that he's actually been their third most important player, even above OG. So I think that, yeah, I think that's a great call there, honestly.
Yeah, and sometimes those kinds of things, as sort of like a shortcut in building the list, make things easier when you're like, okay, I've got the next three players I'm deciding between are all point guards and they play really similar roles. That makes it way easier to rank these three players versus, how do I compare Kyrie Irving to Rudy Gobert or something like that? Like, that's a totally different conceptual exercise and a little bit more challenging. Yeah, so two guys from the same team who do similar roles, like that's really easy to make a call on who's better. Three guys who play the same position and kind of function the same way. That's a lot easier to make a call on. Guys who are totally different ages, different roles, playing for one's playing for a playoff team and one's playing for a team that's tanking. Those are the much harder decisions to make.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I've sort of came up with these lists on my own before, and that's really how I like to start as well. It just makes the list flow a lot easier. And then there's certain guys that just they play so similarly that you really have to have them in the same range, at least in my opinion. I think even if you look at like one example that I always like to do if I'm doing my own personal like top 50 list, which I just have on my docs that I frequently update. I always really like to have Şengün and Sabonis really within the same range just because they're so similar play style wise, and that's always one that I look for. And then even with some of the smaller guards, and now especially unfortunately that they're both injured, like a Damian Lillard and Kyrie Irving, I always really feel as like interchangeable and really right next to each other on most lists. So yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense to me. You sort of mentioned this, bro, the discussion that everyone sort of has their guys and guys that they really advocate for and that they really obviously get excited about and are some of their favorites. So who are some of your just favorite guys that you've advocated for in this list?
I was really excited about Amon Thompson. I think I was certainly not the only reason he ended up as high as he did. I was certainly, when that came up, I was like, yes, let's put him as high as we can get away with. Jalen Suggs is another guy that I just love watching. And the fact that he's making threes, I don't think he has all that much of a spacing effect. I think people would be happy to let him shoot threes, even though he's been hovering around 40% when he's been healthy the past like year and a half or so. But he's another guy I love. Jalen Johnson, unfortunately, being injured. He's another guy, his archetype I find fascinating. Just, has some playmaking ability, incredibly versatile defender, physical, can rebound. Not really an outside shooter yet, but doesn't feel outside the realm of possibilities. He's somebody I get really excited about. And then um I'm a Pacers guy to the degree that I'm a fan of anyone. I grew up as a Pacers fan, and my emotional connection with the team has waned as I've gotten older and watched them go through so many different eras. So I often check myself when it comes to Pacers guys, but I think Aaron Nesmith, TJ McConnell, I guess TJ McConnell did not have a great regular season, but he was so fantastic in the playoffs last year. I think they're Aaron Nesmith, at least, I think is a guy who could have been on the list at the bottom, and I didn't want to argue too strongly for him because everybody else who's on there deserves to be there as well. I didn't want to push a Pacers bias, but he's another guy that I really love. I love the way that he has become such a reliable 3-and-D player, and especially because he came out of the drafts with this reputation as like one of the best shooters in the draft, and he was not a knockdown shooter his first year or two. One of the reasons that the Pacers were able to get him from the Celtics, and he has become just a fantastic piece and such a key kind of glue guy for the Pacers. So he's another one that I really like.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense to me. I feel like Suggs, he was the first guy you mentioned. His value was really highlighted by how the Magic really struggled without him to close the season. And then in the playoffs, they obviously put up a good fight. But just watching that series, I was like, man, if they just had Jalen Suggs out there, obviously I wouldn't want that as a Celtics fan necessarily. But they really could have pushed the Celtics to 6 or even 7 games because they gave them, it was a hard fought 5 games as it is. And he just makes such an impact there as a ball handler, one of the best perimeter defenders in the league. I think he was all defensive team last year, so he makes such an impact on that team. Connective playmaker. I mentioned this earlier, but I really do think he's sort of the perfect guard next to Paulo and Franz. So big Jalen Suggs fan as well, and then Jalen Johnson. As you mentioned, I think the Hawks season would have been a lot different if he had stayed healthy for the whole year. I think this would have been a team that certainly would have made the playoffs, and who knows what seed they would have ended up as, but they certainly would have made the playoffs. And I think he's a big difference maker and a perfect fit next to Trey, really. I think that's a great shout as well. And then you mentioned the Pacers guys, Neesmith especially. I totally agree. As someone who watched him for his first couple of years in Boston, really sort of struggled, didn't play a whole lot. I'm really happy to see how he's developed, and he's just became really great defender, very versatile, just super impactful on that end of the floor. And when you look at this Pacers team, I think it's interesting because defense has always sort of been the main concern with this team, especially in the Halliburton era. But if you look at them since the start of the calendar year, they've been a top 10 defense in the league, and I think Neesmith is a huge reason for that. And I do think another guy in the Pacers, I don't think you mentioned him, but I do think Pascal Siakam at 26 is a pretty fair ranking, but at the same time, I could see him almost jump up the list a little bit just with how great he's been in the playoffs. I mean, he really makes a two-way impact. I think we talk about underrated guys. I don't think 26 is necessarily underrated him, but I think if you look at a lot of lists, he's sort of in the 30s or 40s. So I do think he's a guy that around the league I just don't think gets enough recognition for really everything he does for this team on both ends of the floor. And then especially with Halliburton not necessarily being the most consistent scorer, obviously he's going to make a huge impact as a playmaker, but a lot of times Pascal is asked to really be that traditional number one option and handles a lot of responsibilities as a shot creator. So I'm a big
Yeah.
fan of Siakam as well.
Yeah, I was really wrong on him when they traded for him. I knew it probably raised their floor. I was worried that it was going to lower their ceiling, and I was sort of an advocate of them keeping those minutes open for Jarris Walker. I just it felt like more of kind of like a short-sighted win now move. Like I didn't really think they were going to be a contender with Siakam, and it just I don't know. I was hoping that they would more sort of take the long view with this team, but I was completely wrong. I think they are kind of a fringe contender. They'll certainly have their work cut out with them, cut out for them with the Knicks or the Celtics or the Cavs. But I think they're the fourth best team in the East for good reason, and they've certainly got a long shot chance of making it through. And I love watching him play. I enjoyed watching him play in Toronto, but I really love how he fits on this Pacers team. And yeah, that I was wrong about that one. Not the least bit because Jarris Walker is way further from being ready than I was hoping.
Yeah, that is understandable though. Walker is still, in my opinion, a pretty exciting young player and someone who can eventually really crack that rotation for the Pacers. I do agree that they're really a fringe contender. I mean, I'd love to get your thoughts on this up and coming Pacers Cavs series real quick. I personally do think the Pacers can give them a little bit of a challenge and maybe make the series a little bit longer than most people are expecting. But what's your perspective there?
Yeah, I think they have some pieces to really challenge the Cavs defense. And I think because they push the pace so much, I think they have a chance to get some easy buckets before the Cavs defense is set that maybe some other offenses aren't able to leverage in the same way. I think Halliburton's gonna make the Cavs defense really work too, especially their perimeter defenders, which is kind of their weaker point. So, I would probably pick the Cavs if I was putting money on it. I think this is a decent matchup for the Pacers, and I think they've got as good a chance as anybody in the East besides Boston.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And even looking back to last year on that playoff run, I thought they were the team that challenged the Celtics the most. Obviously, it ended up being a sweep, but all four games were super competitive. And I was just super impressed with how well that Pacers team played. I feel like a lot of people labeled it as kind of a fluky run, but that was something I would push back on. I feel like this team's legitimately good. And to me, they're really the third best team in the East. I personally haven't been too impressed with the Knicks, so I would have them above the Knicks, and I do think they have sort of that outside chance of making the finals. And I could see them potentially upsetting the Cavs. I don't think I would pick it, but I do think it will be a 6 or 7 game series, especially when you look at this team, like you said, how well they match up with them. But also at the same time, they went 3-1 against the Cavs in the regular season, which I don't know off the top of my head, but I think that's the best record out of any team in the league against the Cavs in the regular season, just based off how dominant they were. I know the Celtics ended up splitting that season series with them. So yeah, I think this Pacers team's legit, and they can just score in so many ways. They're so deep, and they really, like you said, they push the pace really well. And I think Halliburton's really the perfect point guard for this team. So there's just really a lot to like with this team.
Yeah, he for me, and we were talking about Trey Young early. He's the anti Trey Young. Like he is happy and he makes his teammates happy, and he's maybe not an elite defender, but I think he's good at that end and does a lot of the things that Trey Young does. Maybe not as well, but I think the impact of it is much better than Trey Young. So yeah, like I said, he's the anti Trey Young.
I agree with that. I feel like that's a good call there. I think when you look at like Trey when he first came into the league, I feel like this type of offense and this type of impact is sort of what we were expecting from him. Obviously, Halliburton offers that with a little bit more size as well, but I do agree. I feel like this is sort of what Trey Young should be like. But to your point about like some of the ball dominant trends and some of the defensive deficiencies that just really hasn't panned out. But I feel like this is the prototype for what he should be like, even though Halliburton is in many ways the anti Trey Young, as you coined it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a good time to be a Pacers fan. It's not always true, but yeah, we're in a good spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're gonna wrap up the podcast here. Any closing thoughts about this list and any sort of social media or articles that you'd like to plug before you head out?
No, thanks for having me on. Nothing major. Yeah, check out the FanSided NBA .com team, which you're a part of. We've got your articles up there as well. We've got a really strong, smart, deep group of writers covering the playoffs, and we'll hopefully update this list again at the end of the playoffs. So mid-June. My guess is it's a smaller set of updates, fewer players moving up and down. I try not to move players who weren't in the playoffs too much, but I think we'll have a few players who take some big leaps based on what goes on over the next couple of weeks. So yeah, stay tuned for that.
All right, perfect. Appreciate you coming on the show, Ian. It was a great conversation, and yeah, hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
We're going to wrap it up there. Appreciate you for tuning in to another episode of the Cassels Cast. Once again, a huge thank you, Ian, for coming on the show. Make sure to go check out Ian's work as well as the complete FanSided 99 list. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next episode.